Marshal Foster Garrison came to the Cordell Ranch in late 1910 for apparent, simple reasons: anomalies in federal documents, cattle that were sold across state lines without the required paperwork. Residents did not register for the census. A bureaucratic investigation, old records, discrepancies from previous years, calculated fines, and a property that technically didn't exist in government ledgers. Nothing that Garrison hadn't processed numerous times on remote ranches where ranchers kept. Bad books. He hesitated, though, because of something about the road that led to the ranch. Was purposefully destroyed along the trail. For months of the year, it was impossible to pass with a wagon due to the deep holes that were dug by hand and the sharp stones that were scattered in different patterns. Visitors were not wanted by someone. On the horizon, the house appeared. Large, two-story building with heavy curtains and tall windows. The construction is much too complex for a normal cattle operation. Garrison saw half of the fields were neglected. Empty stables with little activity to be seen. If this ranch had ever been a working one, it was no longer. The purpose of the property was seclusion, not financial gain. He was met on the porch by Hamilton Cordell, 55 years old, perfect suit. In his graying hair, brilliant, gentle hands, hands that had never worked a day, never fixed a fence, and never held a tool. Garrison was familiar with the type. Men who became wealthy in ways that were never adequately documented. With studied politeness, the conversation went on. With a disarming smile, Hamilton acknowledged the irregularities, offered to pay fines right away, and implied that they were all just administrative errors from long-gone business operations he had shut down. However, Garrison noticed something odd as he was speaking. Two grown men were standing still, observing from the window on the second floor. Then, from somewhere inside the house, he heard a muffled sound that wasn't particularly loud. Weeping, groaning, something human, but too far away to place. Hamilton remained silent. The men at the window remained motionless. The sound went unnoticed. With increasing confidence, Garrison left the ranch that afternoon. There was more than just tax fraud going on. Something that had to be seen, something that documents wouldn't disclose. However, he was unaware that he was going to find a gap in the laws. A place where there was just no justice. Please leave a comment before we continue. From where are you watching? Additionally, subscribe for more if this is your first time on the channel. Tales that delve into America's lesser-known regions. Mason County and the Cordell Ranch were 60 miles apart. 60 miles through desolate prairies, rough terrain, and nearly complete seclusion. When Garrison started looking into it, he found that the property had been in legal limbo since 1895, when Hamilton Cordell bought it with unidentified funds. For 3 days, Garrison meticulously carried out systematic fraud by organizing fiscal documentation, as though someone had researched the precise areas where laws failed, and established operations in that particular gap. Ancient anomalies from cattle shows that appeared to have stopped years ago. Records that ended suddenly in 1902. But the house was still occupied. Until the young man showed up in the afternoon, the federal marshal saw it as tedious work calculating fines, preparing subpoenas, nothing that suggested urgency or impending danger. Garrison heard a tentative knock while he was in the makeshift office above a hardware store. When he opened, he saw a young man of about 20. Years, slender, eyes moving down the street all the time as though he anticipated being pursued. "Is Garrison the federal marshal?" he inquired. Confirmed, he asked to talk in private. Garrison closed the door and offered a chair because of something in his voice, a barely concealed tremor that contained urgency. The youngest son of Hamilton was Joseph Cordell. Garrison became vigilant. The investigated man's son unexpectedly showed up and asked for privacy. When Joseph saw the hesitancy, he promptly clarified that he wasn't supporting his father. He was. There, in spite of his dad. Over the course of the next 3 hours, a fiscal investigation took a radical turn. Joseph started out by describing his differences from his brothers. He was 10 to 14 years old when he attended a Mason County rural school between 1900 and 1904. Daily travel was impossible due to the distance. It would take 20 hours a week to ride a horse 60 miles. Rather, he spent the entire school term 3 months in a row in town with a farming family. He only went back to the ranch during extended winter and summer vacations. He first saw how other families operated at school. He observed girls his age living without oppressive supervision, playing freely, and speaking without fear. He observed women attending church, conversing on the streets, and living freely in public. He witnessed fathers showing their daughters love rather than treating them like property that needed to be protected. Then, in his spare time, he went back to the ranch and the house where Eliza Langley was slowly fading away. Joseph started school in 1900, the same year Eliza arrived. Hamilton took in a young woman who had recently become an orphan as a ward. She continued to occasionally show up during the first few months when Joseph came back during breaks, quiet but alive. Changes started to occur over time. Eliza was confined to the upper floors and stopped showing up during meals. Joseph observed doors being locked and his father's compulsive possession of keys. He saw Hamilton, Grant, and Keenan ascend to the second floor and stay there for extended durations. He heard muffled, unceasing, desperate cries coming through the walls. Joseph talked about a particular instance that altered everything. During the fall term of 1902, he was 12 years old and living with the Chapman family. He was the same age as Sarah, the family's daughter, who was assisting her mother in making dinner. She chuckled, inquired, and quarreled with her brother over unimportant matters. Totally typical behavior for a girl of 12. Joseph then went back to the ranch during winter vacation. He observed Eliza carrying a tray up the stairs, head lowered, moving mechanically, no longer laughing, speaking only when asked, and not existing in the same manner as Sarah. For the first time, he heard Eliza sobbing through the walls that evening. He also heard heavy footsteps in the hallway, a door being unlocked, and Eliza's sobbing getting louder before becoming muffled, as if someone was trying to stop it. Joseph didn't fully comprehend at the age of 12. However, he knew enough to realize that something was seriously flawed and that nobody was taking any action. Joseph observed things normally at school. As he grew older, it became more evident that he had witnessed horror at the ranch that he was unable to identify. At the age of 14, Hamilton concluded that formal schooling was no longer required in 1904. Joseph never went back to school. He was no longer a frequent visitor to the ranch. Not physically imprisoned, but cut off from all life outside of those 60 miles, he became as invisible as Eliza. He was a permanent resident of the ranch, with no way to get away to school. He heard it all. He witnessed everything. He could, during terms, stop running away. 2 births were mentioned by Joseph, 1903 for the first one and 1905 for the second. Infants whose fathers were not formally identified. Invisible to the outside world, children who grew up in the same confinement as their mother locked on the second floor. Then, Joseph said something that caused Garrison to pause his writing. He said he saw Keenan staring at the older girl in the same manner that Keenan stared at Eliza, just as Hamilton stared at Eliza. Joseph understood that the terror wouldn't finish with Eliza. When the girls were old enough, it would continue. He talked for 3 hours. Everything was recorded by Garrison in an official notebook. Details, names, dates, and observations, recording something he knew was morally reprehensible, but was not yet aware could be prosecuted. Long period of silence. When Joseph was done, Garrison questioned why. After years of seeing, he was now disclosing this. Joseph said he had tried to accept the silence and to tell himself there was nothing he could do, but he was unable to do so. I couldn't forget to sleep. He saw a rare opportunity that might not come again when he found out that his father, an outsider with no local allegiances, was being investigated by a federal marshal. Joseph agreed to give a formal testimony, but he stated that he would require protection. His dad was influential. The judge was a close friend. The Cordell family was never looked into by the sheriff. Hamilton would face unavoidable repercussions if he found out that Joseph had spoken. Garrison promised federal protection, an irrefusable warrant, and a pledge to return to the ranch with sufficient authority. Joseph appeared to relax a little. They decided that Joseph would come back as usual, pretend nothing had changed, and wait for Garrison to take action in the days ahead. Joseph got up to go, but he paused at the door. He turned and said something that Garrison literally took note of, that if something were to happen to him before Garrison took action, at least someone would be aware of the truth and feel that it was worth the risk to let Eliza be free. Garrison made an effort to comfort him. Joseph simply nodded and walked away. The last time anyone saw him alive was at 5 p.m. Garrison was awakened the following morning by an urgent knock. Outside, Sheriff Oldham had some news. They had discovered Joseph Cordell dead. Garrison went to the ranch after him. The scene didn't change. Half a mile from the house, Joseph's body dangles from a solitary tree. Keenan Cordell, who reportedly found the body while on a morning patrol, waited close by wearing a suitable expression. Garrison examined carefully something that Oldham had obviously not done. Tall tree. The used branch was difficult to reach without assistance because it was about 12 feet above the ground. New rope, no indications of previous preparation, and no stool or adjacent object. Joseph didn't dress like someone who would commit suicide in a remote place. Instead, he wore polished shoes, the suit he had worn the day before, and city clothes. Empty pockets, as though they had been deliberately emptied. Unmarked hands from scaling a tree with rough barks. When the coroner showed up, swiftly examined and declared suicide. Garrison questioned discrepancies. If someone wanted to avoid a drawn-out investigation, the coroner acknowledged that there were some odd aspects but suggested that suicide could account for everything. Grant and Hamilton showed up with well-balanced expressions of grief. Joseph had always been too sensitive, according to Hamilton, who bemoaned the youngest son's mental fragility. Grant attested to recent depressive symptoms. 48 hours. Suicide was the verdict. Joseph was interred in the family cemetery, on the land. Garrison went back to work. He sat silently for a long time, studying the notebook containing Joseph's testimony notes. The young man had risked his life to expose pages of unsettling details. Joseph passed away less than 24 hours after speaking. Easy to use, definitive, final. Rereading his notes, Garrison opened the notebook. Garrison would make sure this information wasn't wasted if Joseph had paid with his life for it. Garrison stayed up all night, going over every note he had written during the 3 hours spent with Joseph. Fast-paced, detail-rich pages that turned a bureaucratic investigation into something far worse. Even though Joseph's convenient death had already hinted at the truth, he still needed to confirm every detail, turn oral testimony into written evidence, and find out if Joseph had told the truth. He started with the school, a tour of the modest wooden structure, which had a single room and taught children of different ages. Records attest to this. At the age of 10, Joseph Cordell enrolled in September 1900. Typical. Attendance through May of 1904. Abrupt and unjustified interruption at the age of 14. He just vanished from the books. The instructor at the time continued to reside in the community. The 62-year-old retired Mrs. Bertha Carrington has a keen memory. She had vivid memories of Joseph, intelligent, quiet boy who always seemed to be carrying an unseen burden. She talked about a significant shift over time. Joseph was interested and inquisitive in the early months of 1900. He grew more reclusive, perceptive, and haunted over time. By something she was unable to place, Bertha said that Joseph often looked at the schoolgirls with a blank expression. It was more akin to deep confusion than the usual romantic interest of boys of that age, as though he were attempting to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Bertha had once inquired about the state of affairs at home in 1903. Joseph had paused for a considerable amount of time, obviously thinking about disclosing something. Then he shifted the topic and shook his head. Bertha didn't press the issue. She regretted not insisting. Joseph just hadn't come back from summer vacation by May 1904. To find out if he was sick, Bertha wrote to the ranch. It was Hamilton Cordell's answer. Formal education was no longer necessary for Joseph. He was old enough to work on the property. Garrison inquired about Joseph's host family. The name came from Bertha. The Chapman family were farmers who lived 2 miles away from the city. During school hours, they regularly hosted kids from far-off ranches, in return for a nominal fee. Joseph was fondly remembered by the Chapmans, a couple in their 60s. Quiet, polite boy who never caused trouble. He slept poorly, ate little, and woke up from nightmares often, but he never talked about them. Mrs. Chapman recalled the returns. During summer and winter vacations, Joseph left for the ranch. He came back to begin a new term of school. He appeared a little faded and aloof each time he returned, as though something at the ranch was slowly depleting his vitality. Once, she had attempted to find out if he enjoyed being at home. She never forgot Joseph's response, which was that home was a place you had to be, not a place you wanted to be. It was an odd response for a 12-year-old boy. Joseph's detailed timeline was verified by Garrison. 19,904 school years. During breaks, exposure to typical families increased in contrast to the ranch, and at the age of 14, they were abruptly removed. Records pertaining to Eliza Langley are the next step. Records of her. There were few arrivals in 1900. Through informal registration at the local registry office, Hamilton took in a young orphan whose parents had died from the TB epidemic. No formal legal procedure, just one sentence in a book. Eliza had vanished from official records after 1900. She was not listed in any census, other than the mental disorder certificates that Dr. gave Ross Hastings in 1906, 1907, and 1908. There was no medical record. Garrison's suspicions were confirmed by a trip to Hastings. The physician acknowledged that he had submitted records attesting to, most of the time without physically assessing Eliza's mental state. Hamilton explained the symptoms. Hastings diagnosed patients, which was a common practice in isolated places where it was challenging to transport patients to the city. Regarding the births, Hastings clarified that he had not been present at the actual deliveries. Based on the midwife's reports, he only registered them later. Name: Martha Derrick, still alive at the age of 68. Garrison found the midwife, a woman seasoned by decades of attending births under trying circumstances, living on a small property. Circumstances. Her expression changed when Garrison brought up Cordell Ranch. She acknowledged that she had helped with 2 deliveries there in 1903 and 1905. The money was generous much more than usual, but it came with a clear expectation of complete discretion. Garrison questioned her about what she had witnessed. After hesitating, Martha concluded that the weight of secrets kept for so long was too great. 1903 saw the first delivery. Eliza was scared, too thin, and 19 years old. Eliza sobbed, even though the delivery was technically normal, all the way through the procedure, not only from physical discomfort, but also from a state of desperation that extended well beyond the present. Martha saw patterns of bruises on her body that weren't coincidental. She had old scars on her back. She was paid not to inquire. In 1905, the second delivery was worse. Eliza was clearly in decline, 21-year-old with gray hair and shaking hands all the time. The most unsettling aspect, though, was that Eliza remained silent the entire time. 30 years of experience, no screams, no moans, and Martha had never witnessed of a woman who was utterly silent throughout such an agonizing procedure. Martha explained how Eliza stayed with her eyes open but emotionless, obeying commands without showing any human emotion, as though she didn't exist in her own body. Before she could hold the res after that delivery, Martha had to spend 15 minutes sitting in the wagon. Her hands shuddered. She had attended births for 30 years, including instances where mothers and babies perished, and she had never felt the need to sit before leaving. That particular one was distinct. It was not a technical issue, but rather Martha's realization that she was seeing something more than a simple birth. It was proof that something far worse was going on in that house. She observed Eliza's lack of response to the baby's cries. How did she not request to hold the child? When Martha put the infant in her arms, she simply turned her head to the wall. Eliza was not a new mother. She was an inmate who had just given birth to another inmate. Additionally, Martha took Hamilton's money, departed without saying anything. Before Garrison finally asked, she carried that for 6 years. Hamilton tried to call Martha again, but she refused because the experience had upset her so much. She would rather lose money than go back to that house. Eliza Langley was listed as the mother on birth certificates dated September 1903 and April 1905. Unknown paternity. Registered, but no further paperwork was ever obtained. The children were socially invisible despite having a legal existence. Joseph had talked about trying to flee. Garrison discovered documents of 2, formally recorded. An elderly woman approached Sheriff Oldham in August 1906, reporting that a young woman had shown up on her property pleading for assistance. According to Old's documentation, Hamilton obtained the ward from Dr. Hastings using medical records. The case was filed in March 1907 as a domestic incident that was resolved. Eliza paid Old a visit at the sheriff's office. She asked for protection, but she was unable to specify from whom. Hamilton brought the same medical records when Old requisitioned them. Eliza was brought back. Hamilton clarified that the visible marks on her arms were caused by her resistance during mental episodes. June of 1908. 3 nearby families arrived to assist, according to a fire report. Hamilton explained that in one episode, the Cordell family ward had started a fire. The 3 families who arrived to assist during the fire were interviewed by Garrison. Eliza's arrival in 1901 was followed shortly after by a brief encounter with one of the neighbors. A girl with bright brown hair, a straight back, and a hopeful expression in her gaze. She had smiled shyly as she accepted a welcome basket. 7 years later, in 1908, they first failed to recognize her. Hands shaking, hunched posture, gray hair. The neighbor had mistaken her for Eliza's mother because she appeared much older than Eliza. However, physical aging was not the most unsettling factor. It was the appearance. Eliza looked people in the eye when she spoke in 1901. Her eyes were entirely vacant in 1908, staring at the ground as though she had discovered that observing the world was too excruciating. Eliza was never mentioned again after 1908. Garrison compared his notes with the supporting documentation. All of Joseph's statements could be confirmed. Confirmed school, verified births, recorded escapes, and observed transformation. Ideal timetable. Joseph had been honest. Garrison sought advice from a federal lawyer who had come from Austin. He provided all the proof. Joseph's statement, birth certificates, school records, statements from the midwife and neighbors, and records of disregarded escapes. After carefully going over everything, the lawyer rendered a disastrous decision. In 1911, it was not illegal to confine a ward with mental instability. Protecting dependents from themselves was a legal right for guardians. Certain acts in the context of guardianship were not defined by law. Adult women were not protected by law from guardians who used legally recognized authority. The rights of domestic authorities over dependents were almost absolute. All that Garrison had found was legal in theory, but morally repugnant. Garrison searched all night for a way out. He telegraphed Washington and looked up legal codes. It was always some variation of the same response. Beyond tax fraud, there was no foundation for criminal accusations without evidence of a specific crime as defined by law. Garrison made up his mind the following morning. He would take direct action to defend Eliza if he was unable to do so through the legal system. Under the guise of obtaining a federal warrant for a thorough examination of the property, recording citizens for a postponed census, he was going to bring witnesses. 2 federal deputies served as security. Reverend Bryce Austin served as a moral witness, and an attorney served as a legal witness. He tracked down Eliza Langley. He would witness firsthand what Joseph had sacrificed his life to make clear. Don Garrison brought 4 witnesses and a federal warrant to the Cordell Ranch. On the porch, Hamilton was waiting without his premeditated grin from earlier visits, only the deliberate surrender of a man who understood that defying would be worse than collaborating. In complete silence, Grant pushed open the door. The group went across the main corridor. Heavy-framed family portraits, dark wood walls, and manufactured quiet. In the living room, Keenan stood next to his father, his body rigid, his eyes fixed like a watchdog. The warrant was presented by Garrison. Hamilton nodded back after reading it slowly and without hurry. He said that every room would be examined to verify residency. There were only 3 adult men living there, according to Hamilton. Direct inquiry regarding Langley, Eliza. After a brief pause, Hamilton replied that she was confined to the upper quarters, was indisposed, and that visits bothered her. "I need to see her," Garrison said. Hamilton debated guardians' rights, privacy, and delicate conditions. Garrison interrupted, pointing to federal power. Hamilton gestured vaguely for Garrison to go upstairs and yielded. 3 men's weight made the stairs creak. Austin and the lawyer came next, then Garrison. Deputies stayed downstairs, keeping an eye on Keenan and Grant. Dim lighting and a maze of narrow corridors were visible on the 2nd floor. Garrison saw another door, but Hamilton pointed to a particular one. "There is a heavy iron lock on the exterior." He came over and insisted that it be opened. Hamilton claimed it was a waste of space. Garrison said it again. With shaking hands, Hamilton eventually turned over the key. It was the first moment of calm he had had in days. The door opened. The smell hit first. Confinement. The air was still and hadn't moved for years. Accumulated, inadequately cleaned waste. Human perspiration and the odor of an uncared-for, caged animal. The room was about 12 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow window, iron bars inside, a wooden bucket in the corner, a stained mattress, an iron bed against the wall, and no personal belongings or decorations, just enough room to keep a body breathing. Sitting on the bed was Eliza Langley. A 27-year-old woman appeared to have lived 2 lives. Brittle, fine hair that falls over hunched shoulders in erratic tufts. When she breathed, her darkened teeth were visible, with a small gap in her mouth. Stooped posture that would not go away, as though she were carrying an unseen burden. Her hands shook uncontrollably due to neurological damage from long-term stress that had destroyed her nervous system rather than transient anxiety. Swollen joints, fingers half closed in a claw position. Garrison saw old scars from years of violence on her back through ripped clothing when she moved her arm. The absence in her eyes was worse than any physical harm. She avoided looking at Garrison. Anything, staring at an indeterminate spot on the ground as though she had stopped processing reality because she had discovered that seeing was unpleasant. Reverend Austin took a step back and put his hand over his mouth. The lawyer was paralyzed at the door. Garrison came slowly, spoke softly, introduced himself, and said he was there to assist. Eliza remained silent. No acknowledgement, no movement. Garrison saw the kids at that moment. In the corner, 2 girls were pressed up against the wall, between 7 and 9 years old, although children's physical development is much younger. Severe undernourishment. Legs and arms are too thin, uncut hair that is tangled. Both fled under the bed when Garrison turned to face them. They simply vanished into the only hiding spot available without crying. Austin knelt and held out an empty hand in an attempt to make a gentle approach. The older girl urinated out of fear and started to shake violently. It wasn't a fear of strangers, Garrison realized. The fear of men entering that room was conditioned. Men meant something particular, something that had taught that the only defense was to vanish. He took a closer look at the room. There were hundreds of scratches on the wall next to the bed, nails scratched until they bled for years. There are dark stains in the grooves that might be old, dried blood. The marks scratched at varying heights were visible on the opposite wall. Parents use horizontal lines to gauge their children's development. However, these weren't created with affection. They served as documentation, as though Hamilton were. Documenting the girl's development in the same manner that he would document the growth of cattle. A metal ring was bolted to the wall behind the bed, partially concealed. The short chain, which ends in an open shackle, is still attached. The chain was old and rusted, suggesting it had not been used in a long time. However, it had been in use for a long time. In the corner next to the kids years ago, when Eliza was younger and still had the strength to resist, old rags were sewn with thick threads, and pieces of fabric were awkwardly tied into makeshift doll shapes. Thread. Eliza's last-ditch effort to provide her daughters with a toy that she could make out of the limited resources at her disposal. Despite their rudeness and lack of faces, the dolls stood for something bigger. A mother attempting to preserve humanity in a setting that is meant to eradicate it. Due to years of captivity, both girls had obvious scars and marks. Garrison departed, taking command. He went downstairs and turned to face Hamilton. He insisted on explanations. Hamilton discussed guardianship duties while remaining composed. The difficulties of caring for a woman with mental instability, including the need to shield her from herself. Every word was picked because it made sense under the laws of 1911. Regarding the children, they are granddaughters. Eliza's daughters from previous relationships, whose paternity is unknown, and who are protected by charity. In a ranch setting, scars were commonplace accidents. Garrison gave the order to remove them right away. Eliza and the kids would go to church with Austin. The lawyer took pictures of the space and recorded the circumstances. As the house was being documented, one of the deputies found additional information. In Hamilton's office, a heavy iron safe unlocked behind a fake panel. About $23,000 in cash was found inside, stacked in neat bundles, with bills from various banks and states that had accumulated over years. No ledgers indicating where they came from, and no business records to support the amount. Sitting in a safe in a home with no apparent source of income, $23,000 is more than the majority of Texas ranchers make in their lifetime. Every bill, every denomination, was recorded by Garrison. He was aware of who he was. Observing. Wealth that Hamilton had purposefully concealed. Maybe railroad speculation in the years of prosperity. Maybe taking advantage of the fact that fortunes changed hands during the 1893 panic. Maybe something sinister that didn't leave any paper trail. However, there was a difference between knowing and proving. Cash possession was not illegal in 1911. The money was legally Hamilton's property, unless there was proof linking particular bills to particular crimes. It would pass to his heirs through normal probate. Another void in the law. As long as no one could pinpoint the precise moment when wealth without justification became unlawful, it was still protected. Federal fraud led to the detention of Hamilton, Grant, and Keenan. Not one objected. Hamilton calmly mentioned that his attorney would be present within hours, that Garrison would soon discover something about Texas laws. Methodist Church. Austin and women from the congregation provided heated water, soap, clean clothes. Eliza allowed herself to be washed without resisting, but also without participating. Mechanical obedience of a body that had learned not to have its own will. The children imitated, accepted food without pleasure, drank without hurry. None cried, none asked questions. Austin observed patterns that deeply disturbed him. When one of the women raised her voice slightly while calling another, both children froze completely, stopped breathing for seconds, rigid bodies expecting violence that didn't come. The older one maintained obsessive protective behavior with the younger, always positioned herself between her and any approaching man, not like a normal older sister, like a bodyguard of a child who learned early that men represented danger. One woman noticed that Eliza didn't make eye contact with men. She shrank whenever a man approached even Austin with all his pastoral gentleness. 24 hours, Hamilton's attorney arrived from Austin. He admitted tax frauds, offered immediate payment. As for Eliza, the attorney technically demonstrated that Hamilton was legal guardian since 1900, that Eliza was a mentally incapacitated. Dependent with multiple medical certificates, that confinement was a protective measure, not punitive. The attorney also addressed the cash discovered in the safe. Without proof of specific criminal activity, no bank robbery reports matching the bills, no identified fraud victims, no counterfeit evidence. The money was considered legitimate property. Possession alone wasn't prosecutable. Another legal void that protected those who knew how to exploit it. Garrison turned to the municipal attorney. Uncomfortable confirmation. The law had no provisions for what Garrison was trying to prosecute. Judge Calvert made formal review. Tax frauds proceeded, but there was no legal basis for other accusations. The children would be examined and possibly removed, but Hamilton wouldn't be criminally liable for the conditions. Hamilton posted bail. 48 hours after detention, he was free again. Garrison visited Eliza at the church. He tried to explain he was fighting for her. Eliza finally spoke, voice from years, without proper use. She asked if Joseph had tried too. Garrison confirmed. Eliza nodded without surprise, then asked so quietly. Garrison almost didn't hear, and Joseph still died. Garrison had no adequate answer. Garrison didn't accept the legal void as final answer. He organized a meeting with Eliza at the church. Austin present 2 women from the congregation as witnesses. He asked if she would be willing to document in writing what had happened over the 11 years. He explained that testimony might be necessary to keep the children safe, prevent Hamilton from recovering custody. Prolonged silence. Eliza looked at her daughters in the corner, silently organizing blocks, not speaking, imitating play they never truly learned. She finally agreed but said words wouldn't come out when she tried to speak. Austin handed her paper and pen. Eliza held them with difficulty, fingers without coordination of someone who writes regularly. She began slowly, 3 days, trembling handwriting, short paragraphs. She confirmed what Joseph had revealed and added details only a victim would know. She began in 1900. He took me in after my parents died. He was kind for the first months. Promises of a secure future. I was young and believed him. Then he started locking doors, started coming to my room. I didn't fully understand what was happening at first. My family had been sheltered and religious. I only knew something was deeply wrong, but had no words to name it or anyone to tell. She wrote about a specific moment in 1908, the 3rd escape attempt that had permanently broken something in her. The 3rd escape broke something that never returned. It wasn't just that I failed again. It was what he said when I came back without shouting, without hitting, just that cold smile. He calmly explained that I could try to escape as many times as I wanted, that he would always retrieve me, that everyone would always believe him because he had papers, money, friends, that I was unstable according to medical documents, that no one would question a respectable guardian because of a ward with diagnosed problems, that I could stop trying because no one would save me. No one believed I needed to be saved. He was right. I stopped trying, stopped waiting, stopped believing someone would come. The person I was died that day. What lived afterward was just a body obeying until it stopped breathing. She described a typical day with devastating precision. Wake up when he unlocks the door. Could be morning, could be afternoon. There's no window to see the sun. He brings food if he remembers. Sometimes he forgets. Sometimes deliberately doesn't bring any. Empty the bucket if I'm lucky. Wait, he comes, or one of the sons comes. I learned that resisting made everything worse. So I learned to disappear inside myself and wait for it to end. Then they leave, lock the door. Darkness. Repeat. About the children, first daughter born 1903. I don't know who she is. Could be his. Could be Grant's. There was no way to know. Second, in 1905, same situation. I tried to love them, but every time Look, I see a reminder of years without choice. When I saw Keenan start watching the older one the way they watched me, I knew the cycle would continue. I prayed someone would save them before it was too late. About Joseph specifically. Joseph was different. In the early years when he returned from school during breaks, he tried to talk to me, asked how I was, offered to help. I saw confusion in his eyes. He was trying to understand why our house was different from the families he saw in town, after his father pulled him from. School, Joseph stopped trying to talk to me. Not because he stopped caring, but because witnessing without being able to act was torture itself. He began to stay away from the noises in the second floor. I knew what had happened when I heard that he had passed away. The family's sole conscience was killed. Garrison presented the judge with the testimony. The response didn't change. The only point of intervention was with the kids. Permission to relocate permanently to an Austin orphanage. Despite losing the girl's custody, Hamilton faced no more criminal accusations. Hamilton was still on bail. He would pay fines and depart even if he was ultimately found guilty of fraud. And he could then reclaim Eliza in accordance with the legally protected guardianship authority. Garrison went over the evidence of Joseph's death again, verifying any discrepancies that pointed to a planned murder rather than an unplanned suicide. Garrison spoke with Reverend Austin one last time. According to him, laws can occasionally breed monsters by elevating authority above people. That, when it occurs, men must choose between doing what is essentially right and abiding by the letter of the law. Austin merely planted a seed that Garrison had been thinking about for days and nights on end, thinking about Joseph, who died trying to do the right thing, and about Eliza, who survived 11 years of something without a legal name. Austin did not recommend any particular course of action. About Hamilton Cordell strolling freely through the streets with plans to reclaim his property once, and about 2 girls who would have become the next generation if no one had stepped in. Temporary legal barriers were eliminated. Instead of taking any action, Garrison simply watched and waited, ready for the possibility that fate would decide what the law was unable to. Garrison saw them on his way back to the federal office. The road is being transformed into alternating strips of intense brightness and shadow by the golden light of the late afternoon. It was hard to make out faces but not postures as 3 riders approached, silhouettes against the low sun. He knew before he saw. Obviously. Hamilton in the middle, standing erect like a man used to being in charge. Broad shoulders, Grant to the left. A restless hand is already too near Keenan's belt on the right, even though it was hot, dark jackets. Hats with wide brims and revolvers in leather holsters are visible. Garrison and his friends were forced to stop when they totally blocked the road, even though they weren't yet moving in a hostile manner. There were 2 federal deputies with Garrison. They touched their own weapons out of instinct when they saw the 3 Cordells. Garrison. He held up his hand to show that he was both calm and prepared. At 30 feet, Hamilton halted his horse. Keenan and Grant formed a horizontal line on either side. Nobody said anything right away. The wind blew slowly, bringing with it the scent of sagebrush and red dust. There were no towns within 15 miles. There were no witnesses, and the 5 men knew that something was going to happen. Hamilton was the first to speak, and his cool, nearly courteous voice had a sharp edge that cut through the silence. He talked about clearing up misconceptions and how his family had suffered because of excessive interpretations that the state had no right to meddle in private affairs, that Eliza and the children were his property by guardianship right established more than 10 years ago, and that a domestic situation was none of the federal government's business. Garrison answered in a similarly composed tone. He declared that Eliza was no longer anyone's property, that the children would not return, that Hamilton would be put on trial for fraud, and that if Garrison could make a more compelling case for much more, he advised Hamilton to accept the result and move on, since opposing it would only make matters worse. Garrison had seen Hamilton's icy smile before. In response, he said that property owners occasionally had to defend what was rightfully theirs. Since its inception, Texas has recognized the inalienable right to defend one's own property. That circumstances occasionally work themselves out in ways that the courts didn't need to be aware of. There was no hiding the threat. It was clear. Garrison understood completely. There on that deserted road, Hamilton was announcing his plan to kill them and then claim self-defense. It's 3 against 3, not a witness. A reputable property owner's complaint against the federal marshal is already causing too much trouble. Grant was the first to move. His hand moved from the reins to his belt holster. Movement that is deliberate but slow. The intention is very clear. In less than a second, Keenan trailed behind. He lowered his right hand to his weapon. Hamilton's posture changed, but he stayed still. Straighter back, staring at Garrison, getting ready for what was bound to happen. Grant pulled his revolver all the way out. The sound of leather on metal reverberated in the quiet emptiness. Keenan drew at the same time. They both aimed their weapons straight at Garrison and the two deputies. There was no room for doubt or room for different interpretations. They actively engaged in aggression. It was a deadly weapon attack. In response, the deputies automatically trained. They fired in quick succession and drew. Garrison carried out the same. As martial, the movement evolved over time. Nearly all 5 weapons were firing at once. The sound was deafening, reverberating throughout the open landscape. Dust raised by scared horses mingled with the explosion of gunpowder smoke. Grant was thrown backward off the horse after being struck first in the center of the chest. With his weapon still in hand and his eyes open in a frozen state of surprise, he fell heavily. Before being struck, Kennan was only able to fire once. His shot screamed into the empty sky after passing high and missing all targets. The main artery in his neck was pierced by the response. As he tried to press the wound, blood spurted between his fingers and onto the red earth, and he fell motionless. At last, Hamilton recognized that his calculations were incorrect. The horse reared when he attempted to turn it. The smell and sound of blood frightened me. Hamilton stumbled, dropping. His hand eventually moved toward his own weapon as he rolled in an attempt to reach non-existent cover. However, he was hit by 3 consecutive shots before he could finish drawing. Shoulder, abdomen, and chest. He landed on his. Back, eyes open, revolver half drawn, losing concentration quickly. Like a wave, silence came back. For several minutes, Garrison and the deputies stood motionless, their weapons still drawn, their breathing rapid, and their ears ringing. They were all unharmed. Keenan and Grant had either fired too late or missed their shots. The draw was never finished by Hamilton. Garrison walked warily toward the bodies. Grant died at once. No breathing, no pulse, and glassy eyes staring at nothing. Keenan continued to breathe feebly, making a feeble attempt to stop the bleeding that had already consumed the majority of his blood. Garrison watched as he passed away, his final breath escaping as a moist murmur. With blood filling his lungs and a liquid, erratic sound coming from each breath, Hamilton was still technically conscious. He looked at the Garrisons. That expression was one of recognition rather than fear, anger, or pleading. As though Hamilton realized he had lost a game. His lips moved in an attempt to speak, but only blood emerged. In less than a minute, he passed away. Eyes staying open, staring at the sky. Garrison looked over the weapons. Keenan and Grant continued to carry partially discharged revolvers. Unmistakable proof of being active aggressors and of having been fired. Hamilton had drawn part of his weapon. Even though he hadn't finished the action, his intention had been clear. Self-defense is acceptable and lawful in all circumstances. Over the Cordell's horses, they loaded the corpses back to Mason County. 2 hours were spent traveling under a setting sun that turned the sky bloody. Red. A crowd was already starting to form when they got there. In small towns, news spread quickly. They informed Sheriff Olden. The coroner was called. Judge Calvert left his office to watch. Garrison documented events as they occurred. He and the deputies were stopped on the road by Hamilton and Sons, who threatened to protect their property. First, to draw their weapons, Grant and Keenan pointed them straight at federal officers. To save lives, Garrison and the deputies reacted with deadly force. No officers were present when 3 men died, hurt. The deputies testified that Grant had drawn first. Keenan followed right away. Garrison only responded to a direct, deadly threat, and they verified every detail word for word. The coroner conducted a thorough examination of the bodies, verified that Grant and Keenan were carrying weapons at the time of their deaths, found that Hamilton was struck while trying to draw a weapon, and concluded that the wounds were consistent with frontal confrontation rather than execution or ambush. Everything is in line with obvious self-defense. Old did not fight, despite the fact that he had been. For decades, Hamilton was a friend. He had nothing to question legally. Since the state's founding, self-defense has been a fundamental right in Texas. Defenders had the right to use equal force in retaliation if the aggressors had drawn first and posed a known deadly threat. The law was very clear. Judge Calvert examined the evidence with great care. Hamilton and he had been friends for decades, but he was forced to confirm the verdict. In the course of their legal duties, Hamilton and Sons had attacked federal officers. The answer was justified and proportionate. No crime needed to be prosecuted. Within 24 hours, an official verdict was issued. Justified killing in self-defense. The case is over. Deputies and garrison were freed without being charged. For tax fraud, there was no trial. Hamilton had passed away. Charges lost their purpose. The case is filed permanently. To tell Eliza, Garrison went back to the church. She listened emotionlessly, did not cry, didn't grin, simply nodded slowly, taking in the details as though they were about distant strangers who used to rule her life, but were no longer relevant. Minutes later, she posed the lone query. Was she now free? Garrison attested to it. Hamilton had passed away. She no longer had a guardian or any legal claims against her. She was free to do as she pleased and go wherever she pleased. She was once more legally invisible, but this time she chose to be so rather than being imprisoned. Eliza didn't say anything for a while. She spoke softly as she peered out the window at streets she hadn't seen in 11 years. Garrison nearly missed it. 11 years are not erased by freedom. It simply lets you now bear the burden on your own. The two daughters were given to a Catholic orphanage in Austin for good. Garrison used contacts at the federal level to arrange funding. Eliza made sporadic visits, maybe once every 3 months, but she never stayed long. She was reminded of things she would rather keep hidden when she saw the kids. She wanted them to have the opportunity she never had to move on, develop normally, and live free from the burdens of the past. Eliza secured employment as a seamstress. 6 months after the events in Austin, she rebuilt life with minimalist precision, just enough to survive, in a small rented room by herself, in silence. She worked alone, mending tears, making alterations, sewing simple garments, and creating cozy silence. She never got married, never let men get too close, and never told anyone who didn't need to know about the ranch. When questioned about her background, all she said was that she had spent years living on a remote ranch after losing family at a young age. Widowhood or orphanhood was assumed. She never adjusted the presumptions. For 20 more years, Garrison served as a U.S. Marshal. He conducted fraud investigations, detained offenders, and upheld federal laws in isolated areas. He did not, however, forget Eliza Langley. He would never forget the emptiness he had found. That was a place where there was no law at all, where horror could operate under the cover of domestic authorities that were legally established. He never discussed what transpired on that deserted road in public. He never acknowledged that he might have waited for that inevitable. Conflict. Never asked whether there was a good substitute. Because men must ultimately determine what justice means to them personally, when the law consistently fails and when systems shield monsters rather than victims. Garrison concluded that individuals such as Hamilton Cordell should not be shielded by the same legislation that they deliberately abused. To settle accrued tax debts, the Cordell Ranch was put up for auction. The house was demolished 2 years after a family of settlers purchased the land. They were unable to reside there. Incorrect environment. Echoes of things better forgotten seemed to reside within walls. The building went back to the red earth of Texas. After that, nothing was constructed on the site. It was reduced to a barren prairie that was indistinguishable from the thousands of miles of surrounding emptiness. After 10 years, it was hard to detect that it had been built. Silent vastness, earth, and sagebrush. The tale was forgotten. No national media coverage. No legislative changes motivated by the incidents. No historical marker or memorial, just. Some elderly Mason County residents had dim memories of an odd incident involving a remote family that occurred years ago. And as witnesses grew older and passed away, even those memories dimmed. 51-year-old Eliza Langley passed away in 1935. Simple pneumonia in Austin during an exceptionally chilly winter. Buried in a Catholic cemetery with a name and dates only written on the headstone. The 80-year-old Reverend Bryce Austin conducted a brief funeral service. There were just 3 people present. The 2 daughters are now grown women with independent lives that are very different from those of their parents. Shadows and Foster Garrison, who is retired and elderly but still bears the consequences of choices he made many years ago. For a while, Garrison studied the headstone. He considered all the laws he had upheld in his life, all the punishments he had administered, and all the criminals he had apprehended via the proper legal systems. He also reflected on Eliza, who had endured injustices for which there was no law and who had lived in a vacuum that the legal system had created before being routinely disregarded. On that road, he never knew for sure if he had made the right choice. He was never certain if he had become what he had vowed to fight, or if it was true justice. However, he was certain of one thing. Eliza spent the final 24 years of her life sleeping with doors unlocked from the outside. And that must be sufficient. There are some stories that people would rather not hear, not because they are false, but rather because they expose unsettling realities about how social structures shield some people while keeping others in the dark. One of those tales was Cordell Ranch, a location where legal gaps and remote location allowed horror to flourish unhindered for more than 10 years. Remembering Eliza Langley was not something she requested. All she wanted was to live what was left with the silent dignity of someone who had made it through the intolerable. Her suffering did not inspire any social movements or campaigns. Decades after her release, the laws that allowed her to be imprisoned remained unaltered, because in 1911, and for a considerable amount of time. Afterwards, women like Eliza were not seen by the law. Dependency was observed. It observed property. It witnessed the duties of fathers and guardians. The weak vanish into complete silence when legal frameworks are constructed to defend authority over humanity. Joseph Cordell attempted to act as a link between a world capable of intervening and a hidden horror. Less than 24 hours later, he paid with his life. Foster Garrison attempted to apply the law as it was. For those like Eliza, he found, it just didn't exist. That's what men do. When systems are totally unsuccessful, made a choice that would last a lifetime. Mason County and the ranch were 60 miles apart, but the actual distance was much larger. It was the gap between what society claims to safeguard and what it allows to occur in private. It was the gap between the realities of locked rooms and the laws written on official paper. It was the gap between justice as a lived experience and justice as an abstract idea. Eliza was free for 24 years before she passed away. 24 to attempt to forget 11. It was insufficient. It would never be. Opening doors can free bodies, but they don't erase memories of years stolen. Calendars and recovery schedules are irrelevant to trauma. Texas is still a huge state. There are still isolated properties, but they are now connected by technologies that make it harder to be completely invisible. However, there are still gaps in laws. Authority is still safeguarded by structures. Additionally, tales like Eliza's are still told today in updated, time-appropriate versions. A constant reminder is Cordell Ranch. Distance is more than just miles. It's also the number of people who ignore the invisible before it vanishes entirely. It serves as a reminder that those who draft laws have preconceived notions about who should be protected and who should be regarded as property. Despite Eliza's disappearance from official history, questions still surround her. How many others are compelled to remain silent? How many gaps remain in the laws that ought to provide protection? Additionally, when the law systematically fails, what's left on empty roads beyond personal choices? There was nothing but silence, vastness, and the memory of a woman who persevered through something that had no official name.